If a stranger saved your life tonight, how far would you go to repay them tomorrow? Rain hammered the sidewalks of Brooklyn like 1,000 restless fingers as Lila Simmons pulled the hood of her faded jacket tighter around her face and hurried toward the bus stop. The neon glow from a corner grocery store reflected across puddles that stretched along the cracked pavement, turning the ordinary street into a maze of shimmering colors. It had been another exhausting day. 10 hours cleaning offices downtown, followed by an evening shift helping an elderly neighbor organize paperwork for a disability claim. Her feet ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. And all she wanted was to get home to the tiny second-floor apartment she shared with her younger brother. The city seemed quieter than usual. Even the distant sound of traffic felt muted beneath the steady rhythm of rainfall. Lila glanced at her phone. 11:42 at night. Too late for comfort. Too early for sleep. She adjusted the grocery bag hanging from her wrist and continued walking beneath the flickering streetlights. That was when she noticed him. A man stood alone near the entrance of a narrow alley between two brick buildings. At first glance, he looked like any businessman caught in the storm. Dark coat, expensive shoes, tall frame. Yet something about the way he carried himself felt different. He was not looking at his phone. He was not rushing home. He seemed completely still, studying the street with calm eyes while rain soaked the shoulders of his coat. Most people would have kept walking. In New York, minding your own business was practically a survival skill. Lila intended to do exactly that. Then she noticed a delivery scooter speeding through the intersection. The driver appeared distracted, turning his head at the wrong moment as the front wheel splashed through a deep puddle. The scooter veered unexpectedly toward the curb. Everything happened in seconds. The businessman remained focused elsewhere, unaware of what was approaching. Lila's pulse jumped. Without thinking, she dropped the grocery bag and shouted. The man turned his head. At the same instant, Lila rushed forward through the rain and grabbed his sleeve, pulling him several steps backward toward the sidewalk. The scooter passed through the exact space where he had been standing only a heartbeat earlier before continuing down the block. The rider never even realized what had happened. Silence followed. Rain continued falling. Water dripped from the brim of Lila's hood as she caught her breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the stranger looked down at the hand still gripping his sleeve. Lila immediately stepped back. "Sorry," she said, embarrassed. "I just thought you did not see it." The man stared at her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. His face was sharp and striking beneath the rain. Gray eyes, dark hair, the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. "You pulled me out of the way," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but carried unusual weight. Lila shrugged awkwardly. Anybody would have done the same. A faint smile touched his lips. It was the expression of a man who clearly did not believe that statement. Thunder rolled softly across the distant skyline. The stranger glanced at the grocery bag lying on the wet pavement. Without hesitation, he bent down and picked it up for her. Most of the contents remained intact. Bread, milk, medicine, essentials, nothing luxurious. His eyes lingered briefly on the prescription bottle visible through the plastic. "For your family?" he asked. Lila nodded. "My little brother." The man studied her face for another moment. Something unreadable passed through his expression before he handed the bag back. "Thank you," he said. Simple words. Yet they sounded strangely sincere. Lila accepted the bag and offered a polite smile. "Have a safe night." She turned and continued toward the bus stop, unaware that the stranger remained standing in the rain, watching her disappear down the street. She did not know his name. She did not know that people across the city whispered it with equal parts respect and fear. She did not know that Grayson Hunter rarely forgot a face. And she certainly did not know that by sunrise, her ordinary life would never look ordinary again. The first light of morning filtered through the narrow blinds of Lila Simmons' small apartment, casting long, soft stripes across the wooden floor and the modest furniture arranged with careful precision. She moved quietly, adjusting the stack of clean towels on the counter, her eyes catching the soft golden glow on the faded photograph of her younger brother pinned to the wall, a subtle smile forming as she recalled the laughter from last night's homework session. The apartment smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the slightly sweet aroma of oatmeal she had prepared for breakfast, a familiar comfort in the routine that kept her grounded. Each movement was deliberate, from the careful placement of the dishes in the sink to the smooth alignment of papers on the kitchen table, reflecting a discipline honed from years of balancing work, school, and care for her brother. As she poured a cup of coffee, her mind briefly wandered to the night before, to the unexpected encounter with the man who had stood in the rain, his presence commanding yet oddly reassuring, a fleeting moment that left an imprint she could not quite place. The city outside began to awaken gradually, the distant hum of traffic mingling with the chirping of birds perched on power lines, a soft counterpoint to the rhythmic tapping of rain droplets still clinging to the windows. Lila moved toward the small desk by the window, sorting through the bills and medical notes for her brother, her fingers brushing over the textured paper with familiarity, feeling the weight of responsibility and the quiet pride that came from managing the challenges she faced daily. She paused, staring out the window at the urban landscape, the fire escape casting geometric shadows across the brick walls of neighboring buildings, and allowed herself a moment to breathe, appreciating the resilience that had carried her through countless sleepless nights. As the light shifted, illuminating the soft lines of her determined expression, she adjusted the curtain slightly, letting more sunlight fill the room, the warmth contrasting with the lingering chill from the early morning air. Every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren wailing far down the avenue, the soft scratching of her brother's pencil from the next room, created a symphony of ordinary life that grounded her in the present while the memory of the previous night's incident with the stranger lingered at the edges of her consciousness. She straightened the stack of papers one final time, smoothing the corners, and glanced once more at the photograph, a subtle determination hardening in her gaze as she mentally prepared for the day ahead. Outside, the city fully came alive, pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks, delivery trucks trundling past, and the distant rumble of subways vibrating through the concrete beneath her feet. Yet within the small sanctuary of her apartment, Lila remained a calm center, each action precise, measured, and deliberate, reflecting not only the routine of her daily life, but also the quiet strength that had allowed her to act decisively the night before, an ordinary morning imbued with the latent potential for extraordinary events to unfold in the hours ahead. The knock came at exactly 7:12 in the morning. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 slow taps against the apartment door that seemed strangely deliberate in the quiet building. Lila looked up from the kitchen table where she had been reviewing her brother's school paperwork. Her younger brother glanced toward the hallway. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. She shook her head. Very few people ever visited. The landlord usually called first. Neighbors texted. Family lived hundreds of miles away. Another knock followed. 3 measured taps. Lila stood slowly and walked toward the door. Something about the sound unsettled her. Through the peephole, she expected to see a delivery driver or a neighbor. Instead, she froze. A man in a black suit stood outside the apartment. Behind him stood another. And another. She blinked. Her breath caught. The narrow street below appeared completely filled with people. Men in dark suits lined both sidewalks. More stood beside parked vehicles stretching nearly the entire block. The sight made no sense. Her heart began to pound. She stepped back from the door immediately. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Another gentle knock echoed through the apartment. Her brother noticed the color draining from her face. Lila. She forced herself to breathe. Perhaps she was mistaken. Perhaps there was some event nearby. A political fundraiser. A funeral. Anything would make more sense than what she had just seen. Slowly, she returned to the peephole. The men remained exactly where they were. Calm. Organized. Waiting. None appeared threatening. None appeared impatient. Yet the sheer number of them transformed the ordinary street into something surreal. Lila moved toward the living room window and carefully parted the curtain. Her stomach dropped. The view was even more unbelievable from above. Black vehicles lined both sides of the street. Men stood in orderly groups near building entrances. Others occupied positions along the sidewalks. Residents from neighboring apartments peeked through windows. Several people stood on balconies openly staring. The entire block seemed frozen in confusion. "What is happening?" her brother whispered. Lila had no answer. Then she noticed movement below. One of the men looked up toward her window. Noticing the curtain shift, he immediately placed a hand over his chest in a respectful gesture. Several others did the same. No one moved closer. No one shouted. No one demanded anything. They simply waited. The atmosphere felt strangely formal. almost ceremonial. A black sedan slowly pulled to the curb directly across from the building. Every man on the street straightened slightly. The reaction was immediate and synchronized. The rear door opened. Lila felt her pulse accelerate. A familiar figure stepped onto the sidewalk. Tall, dark coat, calm gray eyes. The same man from the rain-soaked street the night before. The stranger she had pulled away from danger. He looked up toward her apartment window, as if he already knew exactly where she was standing. The morning sunlight reflected across the wet pavement, while the entire block seemed to hold its breath. Lila suddenly understood one thing with absolute certainty. The man she had helped was not an ordinary businessman. And whatever world he belonged to had just arrived at her front door. The morning air felt heavy with anticipation as Lila Simmons cautiously moved toward the front door, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood handle, the weight of the unknown pressing against her chest. Through the partially open blinds, she could see Grayson Hunter descending from the black sedan, flanked by two attentive aides who maintained a respectful distance, their postures disciplined, movements synchronized with precision. The sunlight reflected off the wet pavement, casting fractured golden highlights across the street, making the thousands of faces standing quietly in organized rows shimmer like a sea of dark uniforms. Lila's heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears, as the sheer number of people outside became impossible to ignore. She glanced back at her younger brother, who stood frozen by the kitchen table, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "Stay behind me," she whispered, though her voice barely carried across the room. Grayson's gaze lifted toward the window where she crouched behind the curtain, his expression calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the tension emanating from the street. Slowly, he raised one hand in a subtle gesture, and the crowd responded instantly, their body language shifting from rigid vigilance to controlled attention. Every movement was deliberate, every step synchronized, as if they were extensions of Grayson's own will. Lila watched, amazed, as the organized display of presence transformed the chaotic impression of hundreds into a tableau of structured power. The rain-slicked asphalt reflected the pattern of coordination, shadows of men and vehicles stretching long in the early sun, highlighting the extraordinary level of discipline in what should have been ordinary chaos. Lila's eyes returned to Grayson as he moved closer to the building, his calm aura drawing the crowd's attention without a single word. He stopped at the curb, the aides flanking him perfectly aligned, and for a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its collective breath. Lila recognized the precision, the quiet authority that could turn potential threat into controlled observation. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of understanding, realizing that the man she had saved was no ordinary stranger. His world operated on rules of order she had never encountered, yet the weight of his presence was oddly reassuring. The morning light shifted subtly, catching the edges of windows, rooftops, and puddles along the sidewalk, casting a surreal glow that made the street appear almost ceremonial. Lila steadied her breathing, feeling a mixture of awe and apprehension as she returned her gaze to the countless figures standing in perfect formation, each silently acknowledging the power and authority of the man she had once saved without knowing who he truly was. The air remained thick with unspoken tension, every detail, from the glint of the polished shoes on the wet asphalt to the subtle tilt of Grayson's head, contributing to a visual narrative of control, protection, and unspoken promise, a quiet but absolute understanding that this encounter would mark the beginning of a day unlike any other she had ever known. And as she clutched the edge of the curtain, a single thought anchored her. In the face of overwhelming numbers and looming uncertainty, the presence of Grayson Hunter made the impossible seem not only possible, but inevitable. Inside her apartment, Lila Simmons moved with a deliberate calm, each step measured, as the sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes across the modest furniture and well-worn rug. She adjusted the stack of papers on the kitchen table, checking her brother's school forms one last time before the morning chaos of the city began to seep into their space. The distant hum of traffic combined with the occasional honk, blending with the low murmur of neighbors getting ready for their day, creating a rhythm she had long grown accustomed to. Her mind, however, was far from the ordinary routine. The events from the previous night replayed with startling clarity. The moment she had acted without hesitation, saving the stranger, and the strange certainty that had lingered in his eyes. Now, facing the scene outside her apartment, the thousands of men standing silently, perfectly aligned, she realized that her ordinary morning had transformed into something extraordinary. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears as she carefully moved to the window again, her eyes scanning every figure below, noting the precise distance between them, their posture, the quiet coordination of the entire crowd. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Then a black sedan eased to the curb directly in front of her building. The door opened smoothly, revealing Grayson Hunter stepping out with the poised grace that seemed to command the entire street, his dark coat glinting faintly in the morning light, eyes scanning the assembly below. His two aides flanked him perfectly, subtle gestures guiding the crowd's attention with silent authority, as if orchestrated by an invisible hand. Lila's fingers gripped the curtain tightly, the faint pressure grounding her as she watched him signal with a slight nod, the effect instantaneous. Every man standing on the street adjusted his stance, aligning themselves in perfect formation. The surreal precision of it left her breathless. She could feel a mixture of awe, fear, and curiosity swirling in her chest. Her brother peeked from behind her, eyes wide. "Who are they?" he whispered. She did not answer. She did not need to. Her gaze remained fixed on Grayson, observing the calm confidence in his posture, the subtle power in the way he moved, the way he seemed to command attention without uttering a single word. The street outside became a tableau of organized force, a living composition framed by the urban architecture and the early morning light. Lila took a deep breath, drawing in the scent of rain-soaked asphalt mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from her kitchen, grounding herself against the overwhelming scale of the scene. She understood, in a visceral instant, that the man she had saved was not simply a stranger in need of assistance, but someone who inhabited a world governed by rules of order, loyalty, and influence far beyond what she had ever imagined. And yet, in his presence, the fear that should have rooted her in place was tempered by a sense of protection and unspoken acknowledgment, a quiet understanding that despite the immensity of the challenge before her, she would not face it alone. And as she stood there, observing the orchestrated crowd and the composed figure of Grayson Hunter, the morning sunlight illuminating their stark silhouettes against the urban backdrop, a mixture of determination, admiration, and cautious hope settled within her, marking the moment as the beginning of an extraordinary day that would redefine every expectation she had ever held about her ordinary life. The apartment building seemed suspended between two worlds as Lila Simmons finally gathered enough courage to unlock the front door. The metal latch clicked softly, yet the sound felt impossibly loud against the silence outside. Her younger brother remained a few steps behind her, watching nervously from the hallway as she slowly opened the door. The corridor beyond was empty, calm, ordinary. But the moment she stepped onto the front stoop, the scale of what awaited her became undeniable. Rows of men in dark suits filled the sidewalks in both directions. Black vehicles lined the curb for what seemed like an endless distance. Residents from neighboring buildings stood frozen at their windows, clutching coffee mugs and cell phones, trying to understand the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. The morning sunlight reflected across the rain-polished street, turning every surface into shimmering gold and silver. As soon as Grayson Hunter saw her emerge from the building, he took several measured steps forward. Instantly, hundreds of men straightened their posture. The synchronized movement rippled through the crowd like a wave. Lila felt her breath catch. Never in her life had she witnessed such discipline. Yet despite the overwhelming display, Grayson approached her alone. No rushing, no spectacle, just quiet certainty. When he stopped a few feet away, his expression remained calm. The same gray eyes that had studied her beneath the rain the previous night now carried something different. Gratitude. Genuine gratitude. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The city noises seemed distant, muted beneath the weight of the moment. Finally, Grayson inclined his head slightly. It was not the gesture of a powerful man acknowledging a stranger. It felt closer to respect. "Good morning, Miss Simmons," he said. His voice was steady and composed. Lila stared at him in disbelief. "You know my name?" The faintest smile touched his face. I felt it was important to learn the name of the woman who helped me when she had no reason to. The answer left her speechless. Around them, hundreds of men remained perfectly silent. No one interrupted. No one moved. It was as though the entire street had become an audience to a conversation that mattered more than any of them understood. Grayson glanced briefly toward the apartment building before returning his attention to her. I realize this may appear overwhelming. Lila almost laughed at the understatement. Overwhelming did not begin to describe it. Yet there was no arrogance in his tone, no attempt to impress, only sincerity. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope. The cream-colored paper looked simple compared to the spectacle surrounding them. "This is not a payment," he said before handing it to her. "And it is not an obligation. It is merely an invitation." Lila accepted the envelope carefully. Her hands trembled slightly. The paper felt surprisingly heavy. She opened it and discovered a handwritten note. The message was brief. "Thank you for reminding me that courage still exists." Beneath the words was an invitation to visit the Hunter estate that afternoon. Lila looked up from the note. Grayson was watching her quietly. The sunlight illuminated the street behind him, casting long shadows from the hundreds of men who had arrived with him. For the first time, she understood the truth. None of them had come to threaten her. None of them had come to intimidate her. They had come because the most powerful man they knew had decided that an act of kindness deserved to be honored. And as the morning light continued to brighten the city around them, Lila realized that her life had already begun changing in ways she could not yet imagine. The afternoon sun had climbed high, spilling light across the city streets and bouncing softly off the wet asphalt, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of passing pedestrians. Lila Simmons stood on the stoop of her apartment building, the envelope from Grayson Hunter still clutched in her hand, feeling the weight of the invitation and the silent acknowledgment of her courage settle heavily against her chest. The crowd that had lined the streets hours earlier had disappeared, leaving only the ordinary rhythm of urban life in its place. Yet the memory of the organized presence and the precision of their alignment lingered vividly in her mind. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag and turned toward the corner cafe where she had promised herself a brief respite, her thoughts racing over the events that had already reshaped the morning. As she moved along the sidewalk, she noticed the subtle details she had ignored before, the way the sunlight glinted off a puddle, the faint hum of traffic blending with distant sirens, the quiet determination evident in the faces of passers-by. Arriving at the cafe, she stepped inside, the warmth and aroma of brewed coffee immediately calming the tension that had coiled in her shoulders. The familiar hum of conversation, the clatter of cups and spoons, and the gentle hiss of the espresso machine created a sense of ordinary normalcy. Yet her mind was far from ordinary. She replayed the scene from earlier, Grayson stepping from the sedan, the perfect alignment of his men, the calm authority in his eyes, and the subtle way he had acknowledged her courage without pomp or ceremony. It was a display of respect that left her both awed and disoriented. She found a seat by the window, placing the envelope on the table and opening her notebook, trying to collect her thoughts, jotting down details she wanted to remember, the patterns she had noticed, the impressions that had left a mark on her mind. Minutes passed, the city moving around her, yet she felt suspended in a bubble of reflection, the ordinary sounds of the cafe contrasting with the extraordinary morning that had just occurred. Then a shadow fell across the table, and she looked up to see Grayson standing there. No entourage this time, just him. His expression remained calm, composed, yet there was an unmistakable softness in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgment of her presence and the weight of what had happened. Lila rose slightly, startled, yet she did not retreat. Instead, she met his gaze, sensing the unspoken understanding forming between them. "I wanted to make sure you received this safely," he said, indicating the envelope. His voice carried a calm certainty, not demanding, not commanding, but suggesting that he trusted her judgment and respected her resolve. Lila nodded, the first real smile forming on her lips since the morning's shock. She felt an unexpected warmth, a connection that was difficult to describe, a blend of relief, pride, and cautious curiosity. Around them, the cafe continued its ordinary rhythm. Yet for Lila, the extraordinary was now intimately woven into the fabric of her day. She realized that the actions of a few brief moments, the The decision to step forward, the quick reflexes to act, had transformed her perception of the world and of herself, and that the presence of Grayson Hunter was no longer a distant, abstract authority but a tangible part of her experience, guiding her through the delicate balance between courage, recognition, and the quiet unfolding of trust. By mid-afternoon, Lila Simmons found herself walking along the quiet tree-lined street toward the Hunter estate, her tote bag swinging gently against her hip and the envelope from Grayson Hunter tucked safely inside. The sun was high enough to cast warm light across the pavement, illuminating the soft sway of leaves in a gentle breeze, and the occasional bird hopped along the sidewalk, creating a sense of ordinary calm that contrasted sharply with the extraordinary morning she had endured. She paused at the ornate gates of the estate, taking in the meticulously maintained gardens, the trimmed hedges, and the grand facade of the house itself, every detail speaking to careful planning, order, and a kind of understated power. Her heart beat faster as she stepped forward, the anticipation of what awaited her inside, creating a tension that made her shoulders tense and her fingers grip the envelope slightly tighter. The large double doors opened before she could knock, and Grayson Hunter appeared, standing tall and composed, his gray eyes calm yet attentive, observing her with a presence that filled the foyer without a word. He gestured for her to enter, and the door closed behind her with a soft thud that seemed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Inside, the estate was a blend of elegance and warmth. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting delicate patterns on the polished floors, while the faint hum of distant activity hinted at a household alive with subtle purpose. Grayson led her through a series of rooms, each more opulent than the last, yet each carefully curated to feel comfortable rather than imposing, and Lila could not help but notice the quiet efficiency in which the staff moved about, their attention to detail almost imperceptible yet entirely precise. She followed him to a sitting room with a large bay window overlooking the gardens, where a pair of plush chairs waited, angled slightly toward each other, as if anticipating a conversation. Lila placed the envelope on the table and took a seat, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface as she absorbed the magnitude of the space and the presence of the man who had orchestrated such an extraordinary morning. Grayson remained standing for a moment, the afternoon light catching the edges of his dark coat and the sharp lines of his tailored suit, and then he sat across from her with a deliberate calm, his posture open yet commanding, his expression neutral but attentive, creating a sense of focused attention that made Lila feel simultaneously small and significant. She took a deep breath, allowing the quiet rhythm of the room to center her, noting the faint scent of polished wood, soft fabric, and subtle cologne, each detail anchoring her in the present while her mind replayed the morning's events and the extraordinary coordination of the men outside her apartment. Grayson finally spoke, his voice steady and low. "I wanted you to see the estate in the way I experience it, with order, structure, and purpose. Every detail matters, yet none is overwhelming." Lila nodded slowly, understanding the gravity behind his words, realizing that the morning had not merely been an orchestrated display of power, but an invitation to witness the controlled strength and careful intention that defined his world. As she leaned back in the chair, sunlight falling across her face, she felt a cautious sense of relief and burgeoning trust, recognizing that the extraordinary events of the day were only the beginning of a relationship defined by respect, observation, and unspoken understanding. The afternoon light shifted softly across the Hunter estate, painting the gardens in shades of gold and green, as Lila Simmons stepped onto the balcony, envelope now tucked safely in her tote bag, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. The sprawling view revealed perfectly trimmed hedges, winding paths, and the distant city skyline stretching beneath the gentle haze of sunlight, a quiet contrast to the intensity of the morning's events. She exhaled slowly, letting the warmth settle into her chest, appreciating the ordinary beauty that had always existed but had never felt so significant. Grayson Hunter joined her on the balcony, his presence steady and calm, the sunlight catching the edges of his tailored suit, highlighting the subtle contours of his features and the quiet authority in his posture. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the breeze and the distant hum of the city to fill the space between them, creating a moment of unspoken reflection. Lila glanced at him, noting the way his eyes softened as they followed her movements, the rare vulnerability hidden beneath his composed exterior. "I wanted you to see this," he said finally, voice calm, almost gentle, "to understand that even in a world that seems overwhelming, there is order, and there is respect for those who act with courage." She nodded, the weight of the morning's events settling into clarity. Her own heart had carried a rush of fear, disbelief, and awe, yet standing beside Grayson now, the chaos of numbers, crowds, and the early morning uncertainty felt distant, almost surreal. The quiet acknowledgment in his gaze conveyed more than words could express, a subtle validation of her actions, and for the first time, Lila felt that her life, so defined by routine and quiet responsibility, could exist within a larger framework of purpose and recognition. They turned together to look out across the estate, the sunlight glinting off the surface of a decorative fountain, casting sparkling reflections onto the stone paths. Birds flitted between the trimmed hedges, their soft movements adding a layer of calm to the vibrant scene. Lila took a deep breath, absorbing the peace and the latent promise of what lay ahead. The envelope in her tote bag no longer felt like a simple note. It had become a symbol of connection, trust, and opportunity. Grayson's presence beside her, strong yet non-intrusive, offered a quiet reassurance that she was seen, valued, and understood. The moment stretched, neither needing to speak, both feeling the gravity of the day's unfolding events and the silent acknowledgement that courage, honesty, and decisive action had lasting impact. The city beyond the estate continued its hum, distant and indifferent, yet within the gardens, the air was charged with calm triumph and reflective serenity. Lila's shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away as she realized that the extraordinary events of the morning had concluded with affirmation, that her act of instinctive courage had been recognized in the most profound of ways, and that alongside Grayson Hunter, she was stepping into a space where her strength, diligence, and quiet bravery were no longer invisible but celebrated. As the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the manicured grounds, Lila felt a gentle optimism settle within her, understanding that the day had reshaped the narrative of her life, and that the balance between ordinary existence and extraordinary recognition could now coexist, anchored by respect, trust, and the unspoken bond that had been forged through action, observation, and acknowledgement.